Hello, folks, and welcome to Bone Structure with the focus on microscopic anatomy. And even though this is about microscopic anatomy, I'm starting off with chemical composition of the extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix is composed of two basic components, and this chemical composition portion I will be reiterating at the end of the lecture just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So this inorganic matrix, of course, is going to be made of mineral crystals. And we already talked about calcium phosphate earlier on, but now we're going to get into a little more detail. And hydroxyapatite. So hydroxyapatite is going to be our calcium and phosphate. So if you're thinking of our calcium phosphate, which we talked about before, this can be broken down into Ca2 plus and PO4 3 minus. Extra information, you don't need to know it, but I want to tell you that the hydroxyapatite is going to be majority of our actual bone mass, 2/3 of our bone mass, and this is going to make the bones very hard. Okay, why? Because we're talking about the extracellular matrix and we're talking about the mineral crystals of that extracellular matrix. But we don't just want to make bones completely hard. So for example, if you had a dinner plate and you threw it on the ground, of course it would shatter, right? We don't want our bones to just shatter that easily. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure there is an organic matrix, which is going to be our good old collagen fibers. And of course, ground substance, but that's going to be small amounts, so it's really going to be collagen fibers. Now, if this hydroxyapatite is 2/3 of the bone mass, the collagen fiber is 1/3, and that's going to make the bones strong. Okay? So one great example is gauze. If you have gauze, you'll see that it's very flexible, so you can wrap it around as much as you need. But when you try to rip it apart, it's very difficult to rip because of all the fibers that it's made of. So our goal is to see how the extracellular matrix is going to be both the inorganic mineral crystals, or hydroxyapatite, and the collagen fibers, or we just kind of say the organic portion is osteoid. And then when they come together, you can think of a cast. The cast is very rigid to keep your structure in place, but it's also very tough as well. Another way to think of it is if you have cast made of plaster. Now, we're not talking about any other types of cast. We're just saying if you have plaster and you wrap it in gauze, that's going to be able to create something that's hard and strong, or rigid and tough. And again, we'll talk more about this chemical composition, but it is a great place to start when it comes to microscopic anatomy, because you just want to make sure you're understanding what the electrode extracellular matrix is all about before we start getting into the microscopic portions of things. All right, folks, so you know what I'm about to say. Bone tissue is living and dynamic, okay? And so bone tissue, of course, we also call it osseous tissue, is comprised of the extracellular matrix and cells. Now, we spoke about the extracellular matrix, how it's formed with inorganic and organic compounds like our hydroxyapatite and also our collagen fibers, right? But now I want to focus on the cells of bone tissue. And as you can see, they're categorized into two different groups. And we'll talk about that as we go along. The first group is going to be the osteoprogenitor cells, the osteoblasts, and the osteocytes. And then the next group is going to be the osteoclasts, okay? So this is going to help reiterate the mistake I had made earlier on, just to make sure we are getting everything on point. Now, osteoprogenitor cells are going to make progeny, and so that means it's going to make new cells. Okay? And what type of new cells? Stem cells. And so remember, these osteogenic cells are a part of the endosteum and periosteum and that particular coverings. Now, these osteoprogenitor cells are going to create osteoblasts. And if you're thinking of blast as the end, that means you're talking about immature cells. And we can say blast means to build. What is it going to build? It's going to secrete bone matrix. So it's going to be rebuilding that bone matrix. And then what happens is it's going to continue to build that bone matrix, bone matrix, bone matrix. And when you have an osteoblast that gets trapped within the matrix, is just secreted, it becomes an osteocyte. So cyte, we know we're talking about mature cells. Okay, and their goal is to maintain the matrix. Yes, they can do some minor repairs, but the main goal is going to be maintained. What do we notice about the different shapes of these cells? Osteoprogenitor cells are rather flat, and as you can see, they're always going to be on that outer edge of the periosteum, for example, and then we have all the different collagen fibers coming in. Osteoblasts are going to be more thicker, okay, and they look like they're kind of in this square-like shape. And then we also have osteocytes, which are the mature cells that look like they have a lot of little projections. We're not talking about bone marking projections. We're just talking about little areas that are just coming out of the cell here. And the main goal of all these little projections here is to do communication between osteocytes and also be able to communicate with other cells through gap junctions and also get some nutrients and stuff from diffusion. Okay. Now, the next group of our cells of the bone is going to be osteoclasts. So clast means to cut. What are you really doing? You're breaking down bone matrix. And we know that you can release calcium to do that if necessary. Okay. And the real goal of this is to basically make sure you can fix or change things that are happening within the actual bone cell. Okay. So just keep that in mind. And these are going to arise from white blood cells. The white blood cells come from red marrow in the bone. Okay, so just keep those details in mind. And now we're going to go through and get more details for each of the types of cells that we see here. Now, there are going to be more types of cells that we're not talking about here, and it's not our focus, like bone lining cells, for example, but this is going to be what our focus is for the course. One thing we want to add about the osteoclast is what it looks like. Okay, it looks like it kind of has little ruffles on the outside here, and we know anything that kind of ruffles out of the cell is going to increase surface area. So if it increases surface area, it's going to increase absorption. And then one thing we also see is a bunch of nuclei. So it is multinucleated. And we also have a micrograph of this as well. Here's the multinucleated areas here. And we also see the ruffled border of the osteoclast. And so that means that, yes, osteoclasts are all about reabsorption. So they can take that bone that they're breaking down, the broken matrix, and they can digest it or put it back into the cell or release it if we are dealing with calcium homeostasis and things like that. So it's going to be getting those details of those as well, which is going to be pretty interesting. All right, let's focus on osteoblast first. And so, of course, blast, as we said, is going to equal build. So we have our osteoblast cell here, and we see that it's building. And what is it building? Our extracellular matrix here, secreting things to build that extracellular matrix. So it's producing new bone matrix. Okay? That means it's going to secrete collagen fibers and calcium. That's calcium building enzyme. That's the ion version of calcium. Just to let you know. Calcium binding enzyme, excuse me. And so all these things are going to be necessary because remember we said for bone cells and also bone tissue or osseous tissue, a lot of those calcium, well, the calcium minerals are going to be attached to the extracellular matrix as well. Okay. Now, osteoblasts are going to arise from osteoprogenitor cells of the periosteum and the endosteum. Okay. And another thing is when these osteoblasts become mature, they become osteocytes. Let's not forget about that. Let me rewrite mature. And they're going to be active in bone growth as well. Why would they be active in bone growth? Well, think about it. If your goal is to get bones to be wider, then that means you need to lay new bone on the outer surface. So think of appositional growth. If your goal is to make new bone on the inside of the bone, like for a long bone, then you're thinking of interstitial growth, right? So osteoblasts are all about dividing to create extracellular matrix. And so if you're thinking about that, you're like, okay, it's acting as a specialized connective tissue. And so that's what we end up thinking of there. All right, let's move on to osteocytes. And so we already know osteocyte is equal to a mature cell. And mature bone cells that maintain the matrix. That's the whole goal. You can also think of it as a trapped osteoblast becomes an osteocyte. So you have your osteoblast, and it's going to be secreting all the extracellular matrix. And then a lot of times it gets trapped in its own extracellular matrix. And so at that point, it becomes an osteocyte. Okay? Now, we already know that osteocytes are going to be housed in our lacunae. Okay? And those are like little rooms that are going to house our osteocytes, which again are mature cells, and also they're basically our trapped osteoblasts that become mature. So again, as you can see here, we have an osteocyte, 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 boom, 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 and of course those osteocytes are within Puni. And because we're talking about osteocyte, we see all those little projections in between. And those projections are to allow these osteocytes to communicate with one another and also exchange communication amongst nutrients and stuff through gap junctions. Okay? Now, one cool thing is because they're all communicating with one another, they have the ability to monitor bone stress. So they're like, hey, we definitely need to create more bone here because I feel like this person's gaining weight. That's one example. It's like, okay, well, we need to make sure that we're getting more bone in this area. Or, hey, there's not enough calcium that's going to be in this part of the bone. Okay, we need to make sure that we are producing more calcium, for example. It's because remember, bone is always going to be remodeling and, of course, building new again. And so how does it do that? Where you have osteoblasts, and these osteoblasts are going to build. And then as we'll see next, we have osteoclasts, which are going to remove. Okay? So the osteocytes, because they're able to monitor stress and contribute to calcium homeostasis, they have the ability to say, hey, other cells, we need to be doing this or doing that. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, how are they allowed to have all these communications and diffusion of nutrients? Like we said, it's going to be those projections. And that's specific to these osteocyte cells. Now let's go ahead and get into osteoclasts. Now, osteoclasts are all about clast is equal to cut. Okay, so that means you're removing some of that bone matrix. And so they're specialized for osteolysis. Now we know osteo means bone, lysis means to break. So that means it actually can dissolve bone, and it has, because of those little ruffles that they have on the outside of these actual cells, they're going to be a part of bone reabsorption. I don't know why this is looking so raggedy. Hold on, let me write that. So reabsorption. Okay. And what does that mean? It means it can take broken matrix into the cell and digest it. And that means it can just like reabsorb what it's doing to basically be used to help remodel the cell, for example. Or again, it can go ahead and give extra calcium that was broken down to other parts of the body. There you go. So some of the structural features of osteocytes, as we said before, is that they're very large cells that have rufflings and they have a bunch of nuclei. So yes, it does look like a jellyfish a little bit. And that's very cute. But this is what like it will look like here, and this is what it will look like in a microscope. So it doesn't look as jellyfish when you see it, but you definitely see the ruffling here to increase surface area, and also for secretion, if you're thinking about that as well. And then we have all the multinuclei as well. Okay? So again, multinucleate, that's why they're very large cells. Again, they're derived from white blood cells, which come from red bone marrow. They have a ruffled border, which is going to increase surface area. Now, surface area is very important, especially if you need something to help you. It's not just like they're going around saying, I'm just going to break some bone matrix. No, they need help with that. So they can actually secrete acid, which is going to dissolve the inorganic parts of the extracellular matrix. So we're talking about the hydroxyapatite that we saw before. And it's going to be secreting enzymes to digest the organic matrix, like the collagen fibers. So some examples of this will be like if you put a bone in vinegar, an acid, weak acid, but it's still an acid, then you'll see that the bones become more flexible because they are being broken down at that point and the matrix is being dissolved. The majority of the matrix is going to be the hydroxyapatite, and that's going to give it its hardness, right? Like we talked about before. So we know that when you add it into acid, that will start dissolving and going away. And then if you're talking about the organic matrix, you can use something like bleach, which is going to digest the organic matrix, and then you won't have all those collagen fibers there giving it any extra strength. Okay? Another thing, like I said, that we don't go over too much is going to be bone remodeling, but osteoclasts have a lot to do with that. Number one, it's going to be osteoclasts and osteoblasts, like we saw before, that's going to work together to maintain the skeleton. And how they know where things are going to be needing to be changed or fixed They use the osteocytes. The osteocytes are the ones communicating with one another. So say the osteocytes like, hey, we need some bone to be remodeled here. And think about how much bone remodeling you would have to go through. I mean, your body is going to be all about maintenance and responding to stress. So like I said, if you gain some pounds, then guess what? You're going to create stress lines in your bone, and those stress lines are going to be areas where like, hey, we need to make sure that we are rebuilding this bone to be able to deal with the excess weight that's there. Okay? Just keep that in mind. And then of course for calcium homeostasis. So here we have an osteoblast, and here we have a osteoclast. And as the osteoclast is breaking down that bone matrix, you see the osteoblast coming in and rebuilding. So it's like breaking and rebuilding, or cutting and rebuilding, or removing and rebuilding. Okay? And this space is because this osteoclast has broken down that matrix in between. Right, folks? So just keep that in mind as well. I did want to ask something about reabsorption. Just remember that because these osteoclasts can secrete enzymes because of their ruffling that they have, they also can pick up matrix and use it. Like say, hey, I'm going to use some of this excess matrix for, helping out with bone repair or fixing the bone, for example, or I can just digest it. So we know all the bone cells. Let's go ahead and get into basically just get into more details of how the bone cells are structured at a microscopic level. And that's going to have everything to do with the osteon. Now, we know about osseous tissue. We saw this before when we were talking about the different types of specialized connective tissue. And at that point, we realized, hey, there's some osteons, and they're made of lamellae. And the osteons also have a central canal. And the lamellae are made of, or they have lacunae that's going to be in the lamellae, which, of course, are going to hold our osteocytes. Okay, so we have all those little details. And then we even said there's going to be different canaliculi or little tunnels that's going to help with nutrients as well for the lacunae and of course the osteocytes within them. So let's get down to some of these details. So an osteon, or you can always see it be called a Haversian system, is a structural unit of compact bone. Okay, compact bone. Now an osteon is going to be comprised of three things: the central canal, lamellae, and lacunae. Now let's talk about the central canal. This is going to contain all of our blood vessels and nerves. The lamellae are going to be our concentric rings of the matrix. And of course, the lacunae is going to be chambers that contain osteocytes. Let's see what that looks like on our diagram. So of course, the osteons are going to be circular pieces here. It's kind of all packed in. And then we know the osteon is going to be made of layers upon layers of the lamellae or rings, okay? And so if you were to kind of pull out an osteon here, you'll see that this can be a layer of our actual lamellae, another layer for our lamellae, okay? Another way you can see it here is that we definitely see lamellae layers going around this osteon. Okay, and you even see it here, lamellae rings going around in that circular area. And another thing we also notice are going to be the osteocytes, and those osteocytes are housed in lacunae. So we can even see the osteocytes, like the osteocyte here, here, here. Let me erase all the other lamellae stuff. Okay, and we'll be able to see some osteocytes that are housed in lacunae. Okay, so really we're just looking at lacunae, and then inside those lacunae, we know is going to be osteocytes. Now, of course, everything is labeled. So our central canal, which we're going to have all of our blood vessels and nerves, are going to be labeled here in A, which you can clearly see blood vessels and nerves. And then B is going to be our lamellae. Make sure I can erase this. B is going to be our lamellae, which again is going to be layers of concentric rings of the matrix, which we see in B. So that's 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layers of lamella, which of course come together to form the lamellae. And then lacunae is going to be all of the different chambers here that's going to house osteocytes. And we see that in all little areas that is pointing to for letter C. Now, of course, that's great when you're thinking of microscopic anatomy, but we have to go into a little bit more details because the goal is not every single central canal is going to be able to get nutrients to every one of the osteocytes inside the lacunae here. So what do we have? We have the osteocytes being able to communicate with one another, and we have them being able to have canaliculi, right? And that's going to be our little tiny tunnels that we're doing and that are able to, of course, diffuse nutrients. And those canaliculi are going to be able to be in all different directions, and I'll show you what some of them are here. So you see for letter E, you have canaliculi here and here. I'll show you some here, 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 here. Boom. You have a bunch of them, and that's where that communication between our lacunae is going to be to help being able to communicate and also be able to provide nutrients. Now, the function is communication transport, excuse me, not transport, transport between osteocytes, and they're also very small, very, very small tunnels, okay? Now, let's get into other types of canals. Well, first we have the central canal, which we already talked about, and that's going to be parallel to the length of the bone. So here, this can go all the way down depending on how long that bone is, and it's going to be parallel to that length, and that's where you see those central canals. And then we have the perforating canal. And those perforating canals are going to be perpendicular to the central canal. So this will be considered a perforating canal. That's where letter D is pointing to, perforating canal. Okay? And the cool thing about these is these are going to connect the central canal to other blood vessels and nerves. And so that's how we're able to build the system of all of this amount of blood and nerve endings that are going to be nerves and nerve endings that are going to be a part of the bone itself. Now, central canal, we already know, is going to supply blood and house nerve fibers, and both of these central canals and perforating canals are very large. And we're not saying ginormous because we're talking about microscopic, but we're saying they're large enough to house those blood vessels and nerves. Now let's get into a little bit more detail about the lamellae, because that's going to be something that could be harder to understand, especially since we're talking about concentric rings of matrix. And of course, they're made of collagen fibers as well. So let's get into some of that detail. We know that lamellae is layers of bone matrix. It says bone. I don't know what's going on. Okay. I apologize. Okay, bone matrix. And we know that bone matrix is going to be made of collagen, which is going to be the organic part, and of course, hydroxyapatite crystals, which is going to give it its hardness. Okay, so that's one thing we need to figure out. And now the arrangement of lamellae gives bone their strength. The question is why? And how does it give strength in multiple directions? Well, let's go ahead and look at an osteon here. So this is going to be an osteon. And that osteon is made of layers of bone matrix or lamellae. And we have 3 different lamellae or lamella that's a part of this lamella. So here's our first ring, our second ring, and our third ring, all layered to be a part of that osteon. Okay? What do we notice about these rings? I notice that there's collagen fibers coming in this direction. And of course, they're all spiraling around. So we want to keep that in mind. So I see collagen fibers here. I see collagen fibers here. Okay. And finally, I see collagen fibers going in another opposite direction here. So think about it. We have one area that's going to be swooping collagen, well, one layer is going to be swooping collagen fibers this way. Another layer that's within that is going to be swooping collagen fibers the opposite direction. And then we have yet a third layer that's going to be swooping collagen fibers in the other direction. It's all going to be in a spiral. And guess what that's going to do? It's going to give strength in multiple directions. So we got to keep that in mind. So within the lamella, you have the direction of collagen fibers. And if they're in the same direction, you're talking about one single layer of lamella. So for example, this piece of lamella here is going to have collagen fibers all in one particular direction. This is going to have collagen fibers in another direction. This one's going to have collagen fibers in another direction. Okay? Now, if you're talking about the effects this is going to have, it's going to increase the strength of the actual lamella. And therefore, strength of the bone. Now, between adjacent lamella, you're going to have alternate directions. That's alternate. And this is going to resist twisting. So just if you had anything, if you keep twisting bone and twisting bone, if it didn't have this arrangement, then guess what? The bone will break. But because the lamellae are organized in this such arrangement where it allows you to have one layer lamella that's going to be in one direction of collagen, the second one, that's the inner layer, is going to be in another alternate direction, the third layer is going to be another alternate direction, and depending on how many layers you have, no matter how much you twist, you have strength from all the different twisting. And so that's how it's able to resist that twist. Another way to think of it is that all this stuff is running in spirals in opposite directions. And that's how you're good at resisting the twisting. Okay? So yes, collagen is going to give strength, but the arrangement of collagen is going to give strength in all directions. Now, the last little piece of microscopic anatomy we're going to talk about is going to be spongy bone. Because I definitely want to go back and talk about trabeculae a little bit more detail. And so let's think about that. Remember that spongy bone is named for its sponge-like appearance. But of course, I also say like a lattice appearance. That's one thing that I think. We'll talk about that at the end of this slide. Okay, and we know that trabeculae are small rods or struts that are in the spongy bone. Another way to think of it is spongy bone has a lot of holes in it, and the trabeculae are going to be the areas that are not in open space. Okay? Trabeculae are going to contain lamellae, osteocytes, and canaliculi. Now think about it. What are they not containing? They have no organized osteons. In compact bone, we saw that we have those osteons that are all packed next to one another, right? But in spongy bone, we don't have that situation. So here's going to be some trabeculae here, and we're going to take a piece of that trabeculae and basically illuminate it here or zoom it in. And what we see is definitely some lacunae. I definitely see a good old osteoclast there. And I see rings. So I know we're dealing with lamella. Or lamellae, excuse me. And different lamella coming together. And of course, because I have lacunae, then I know that it's going to be canaliculi that are going to be around to help get those nutrients within them. Another thing we understand, or what we see, is that we definitely have this cross section here, the bone, and you see that there's a lot of osteocytes close to the edge of the bone. Why might that be? Well, remember, the osteocytes are going to be right there where the endosteum is as well, because it's lined with endosteum. And that's going to be great because you need to get those nutrients and everything. You need to be close, even with the spongy bone. The unique thing about spongy bone is it's going to align with lines of stress in the bone. So again, you can have a lot of stress in the bone, say for example, weight. And so instead of just shying away, the spongy bone itself is going to take the weight on, like head on, right? It's going to take on the weight head on. So what that means is, yes, all that extra stress that's coming from excess weight, for example, the spongy bone is going to be there to take in that extra stress because of its scaffolding structure. So think about it. That's the reason why our spongy bone is kind of scaffolding. You have this trabeculae, which are like these rods or struts to help maintain that structure, even when we have things like excess weight. Okay? Now, there's other ways that you can, well, other names you can call spongy bone here. So sometimes it's going to be called trabecular bone or cancellous bone. And trabeculae is Greek for beam or timber, and cancellous is Latin for lattice. That's the reason why I always think lattice, because you can also call it cancellous. And that kind of ends our conversation about microscopic anatomy. A lot of little details. Our main focus, as you can see, is going to be compact bone. I want to bring spongy bone back in here just so you understand that the trabeculae of spongy bone are very important when it comes to structure and also aligning with the stress of the actual body and being able to take in that stress. All right, folks, see you in our final video.